I'm going to kick off our seminar today. My name's Peter Graham. I'm an Associate Professor of Architecture here at Bhatta, and I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge the kind of millennia of creative practice and the sort of learning that's been happening on these lands, and wish to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that as we are online, other people who are on the call may have other lands that they are on, and are equally appreciative of the ongoing practice and I guess cultural base that we're all drawing on and have benefited from in our work. And certainly today, with the topic that Astha is bringing to us, I think it's quite apt in terms of learning about ways of managing land and water, and so much that we can still learn from our traditional cultures here. So as context for this research seminar, which is a series that MSDI has been working through to promote collaboration on questions of sustainability, how we address, the myriad now of global problems that we face and the urgency of tackling climate change. We at MADA are really, really pleased to be able to host you, Astha. MADA and MSDI have been collaborating on many forms of what we might term place-based and impact-focused research over the years, and also learning. This has become known as Living Lab, but perhaps we are doing this kind of work but not calling it Living Lab. One of the programs that we are collaborating on, which is called a Living Lab, is under the AAC Linkage Zero Emissions Precincts Project, and Darren Sharp, who's on the call, has been playing a fundamental leadership role in that program, and that I think is coming towards the end of its lifespan. And I think this is also quite a timely discussion, because having gone through a process of designing and implementing Living Lab work, what are we learning from it, and what can we learn from international examples like what you're bringing with us today? So without further ado, I will introduce Astha Bhatta. Astha is a PhD researcher at the Faculty of Technology Policy and Management at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, and has been exploring the contribution of living labs in building climate resilient land and water systems. And so Astha, you can see you have the presentation here up on the screen, and so I'll just pass it over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. This rainy morning. Well, it's a pleasure to be here in a small group, but still to be able to share what I did during my research in last 3.5 years. It's a little weird to just talk about what I did and what I got, but I think I would also like to have a discussion, questions, if you can relate with my work in some ways or not. So yeah, putting it out there before I start. And if you have any questions during, also please don't hesitate to stop me in middle. That's also completely fine if there is something, So, yes, sorry, for a second.
Sorry, just before we start, I was checking if you wouldn't mind if we record the...
Oh no, absolutely fine, yes.
It looks like it may already be.
Yes, it's already recorded. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Got it, thanks.
So, today I will talk about my PhD research topic, which is living labs in land and water management. And what I focus mostly within this research is understanding the learning outcomes living labs policy influence. I am from TU Delft. I also work with Deltaris, which is also a research institute in Netherlands. And this project has been funded by the Dutch funding what's there. So this is something that I always like to start with when I introduce living labs to people. I think our group here is quite familiar with what living labs are, but I think this is kind of a breaker to introduce the concept, because a fully functioning roof can look like picture A or picture B here. And in the same way, here A and B are two pictures of what a flood resilient example could look like. But there are very different solutions for the same problem, and which option do we choose to address a problem can become very different based on who is making the choice, who is in the decision-making power, who is considered while making the decisions, the stakeholders involved, and all these kinds of things. So with this backdrop, I always like to introduce living labs, because in living labs, the decisions are made where users are the center of the innovative solutions. They come together in real life environment and they co-create with multiple stakeholders. So this is the backdrop where we can introduce living labs. But even with this wordy definition, we know that with all of us who have started working in living labs might have come across this myriad of types of living labs and definitions of living labs, where the starting point can always be confusing. And one of the reasons why that I have found out is because living labs have expanded so much in their application domain, but also in their, where are they located? So when they were started mostly from private area, with the focus on private area, where it was more about making the technologies better. It was more focused on the ICT innovations, and they were starting early 2000s. But with the expansion in present, they are used in so many different fields. We have, if we look into the location of where they are located in the campus, like what we have here in this university. There are rural living labs, urban living labs, regional living labs, and these are more at the geographical domain. But across that, there are also this domain of what are they doing? So there's more application domain. They're working in health sector, energy sector, tourism sector, or they're working for net zero emission, which this faculty is working towards. So there are this different kind of expansion of living labs, which has made understanding their characteristics quite ambiguous, because, okay, where do we start? What do we understand as living labs? So that was the starting point of my research, where I want to look different things within the research. So first, I started with understanding this evolution of living labs. What are their core characteristics? Okay, what make a project a living lab? What exactly is it? So that was the first question I asked. And as I formed an understanding on this, I moved into understanding, okay, but when we look into living labs, we just look into develop a learning framework, I apply it, and then I look into the policy landscape. I go to 2, 3, and 4 slowly. Let's start with 1. Okay, so with the first one, after looking into all the living labs literature which are there with a systematic literature review, I distill these 4 main characteristics that makes a project living lab, because without one of this, you cannot really claim it's a living lab. And they are, okay, you have to be in a real life setting as opposite of lab setting. You have to pursue some kind of innovation and learning. However, it could be not just technical innovation, but social innovation. But then there should be some sort of innovation, pursuit of innovation, but not just imitation of a result. It should be user-centered, identification of the end users and being centric towards the end users. And there should be involvement of multiple stakeholders. But what is also quite interesting in living labs, which make it strong, I think, is that each of these characteristics have lots of variation within them. So if we look into real life setting, you could just be an experimental kind of lab, but you could also move towards exploration, experimentation, but also evaluative. It could be on the place-based physical living labs, and it could also include virtual space within it. It could be in multiple scales. So within each of these characteristics, there are quite some variations. And because of these variations, starting point of living labs can become a bit ambiguous to start with. But maybe understanding this will make it a bit clear, okay, even I lie here in my living lab lies here, so that gives a little bit of starting point of definition. And the second thing is, for example, if we look at a nature-based living lab, then there is another layer which makes it a nature-based living lab. And those are the things that we could see in specific kind of living labs. I can imagine if we have a net zero living labs, then you would have an additional core characteristic which is related to the particular application. So that's another layer that is still lying underneath. Now, as we, okay, maybe just here, yeah. So as we understand that, okay, living lab is a way of working where you co-create in real life setting, centric to users, involving multiple stakeholders, and as a result, it leads to innovation. So this is the kind of idea behind living labs. Main thing here is the relation between co-creation and innovation. You co-create, thus you innovate. That's the core idea in the living lab. But what is often also not really thought of or worked out is how does co-creation leads to innovation? Like what exactly results co-creation into innovation? So among many other things, one of the things that lead that's relational between co-creation and innovation is learning. Co-creation is something where different stakeholders come together, and that's during the co-creative activities, learning takes place, and that learning is also a prerequisite for innovation. So that is the center part of one of the core part of this relational equation. But what's also important here is oftentimes in this projects like Living Lab, we only focus on get out of it. But if we focus on learning, then you really can capture what do we get out of the project outside of its core result alone, because you have a lot of other kind of outcomes that you can capture in this kind of projects because of this multi-stakeholders real life collaboration. So okay, so as I looked into learning, there was also another question that came in front of me, which is in a lot of living lab literature, there is this question of being very empirical and not having this theoretical grounding into science. So how can I try to make living labs concept be grounded into its epistemological founding? So that was another question I want to deal with while looking into this part. So I wanted to look into learning theories that are applicable for the living labs. And what I did was try to look into living labs and learning theories or learning that living labs apply. And there were like 4 papers in total where living labs are applying learning. So that's very rare. So what I did was I looked into all these characteristics of living labs, and I looked into what kind of learning theories are applicable to this characteristic. So my approach was a bit different in that sense. And these are the 9 or 7 blocks of learning theories that I could find out. Make quite some big chunk. And these are the kind of learning theories which are also often talked about now, that you have this real life experiment. So, you have this action-oriented research, social learning. These are the kind of one-off words that come across in the living lab literature, but not with the theoretical background that it requires. So when I looked into this learning theories, I was like, okay, so these are all the applicable learning theories, but not all living labs focus on these theories, and it's not necessary that you could focus on one or the other or a lot, but how do you capture what kind of learning is occurring? How do you kind of make it in more applicable way? How can we capture this learning? So what I did was I developed a learning framework where I asked 3 different questions. What is being learned? How is learning taking place? And who is learning? So it's A, B, C. With what is being learned, I looked into the learning type. So I looked it into with all these different learning theories. In some, there are focus on relational value. In some, there are focus on capacity value. In some, there is focus on, really learning the content value. So based on those, I developed this content, capacity, and network, which were 3 types of learning that was easy to capture relatively. And with the learning process, I looked into 2 types of learning, which is incidental and intentional, because a lot of times we have this intentional learning where you plan to learn, but the other times there are a lot of this incidental learning which you don't really plan. In example, during social learning, but you can have a lot of unintended learning during the social co-creative activities. In the same way, within learning levels, you learn as a person, you reflect at your assumptions, but at a team, you can build something together based on this combined knowledge. And it also happens at the same thing can happen in the organizational level, and what you bring outside of through the living labs to your own organization. So those were the kind of breaking down of what's happening in the living labs through a learning point of view. But developing a framework alone is not enough. You have to also apply it to see how useful is it, and how much can you get out of it. So that's what I did. I took a project called Klima, which stands for Climate Adaptation in Practice. It's a project in Netherlands, which was active for almost 4.5 years at a very large scale. So it's almost 30% of Netherlands. There were various pilot sites throughout the country in the sandy soil area. And they were, with a lot of stakeholders, with over 24 stakeholders. And the main idea behind this project, the main intention was to develop climate resilient sandy soil and water landscape. So I followed this project for about 3 years. I attended all their, I was not the brain behind the project, but I attended all their workshops. I went through all the fields. So I just was a part of the project as a kind of observer participant. And then I also interviewed many people who were in the project to kind of apply the framework to understand the learning that was happening in the project. So I developed 7 different learning pathways based on the learning framework. So I'm going to go talk about these pathways now. So the first pathway talks about developing integrated knowledge, a systems level knowledge, because of how different stakeholders from different disciplinary background can come together, share their knowledge in a way where they learn from their failures and they go through this iterative process to generate a new insight. And because it's on the real life environment, they are working in the field, they're working in with their, the action-oriented work. The kind of knowledge that you generate is different from the first one about substantive knowledge. The second one is about network formation. So I've also come across a lot of terms like this relational infrastructure that living labs create. And that also occurred something within this pathway as well, how you know that because there are people from different organizations, including government, private, academia, and all this, where do I have to consult to get my work done? So it's like having this formation of network where you can have this formal ties, but also informal ties, getting things across in a way. So that's about the second pathway. Third is about capacity development or capacity enhancement pathway, where you have the content, you develop a new knowledge, but being able to apply it, being able to use the tools, being able to use the techniques in a right way is something different from just understanding the concept. So it is something that when you are involved in projects like this, you develop this capacity to use the tools that are generated, use the techniques that you have in right way, in the right time. So you learn through the iterative process what has to be done. So it's about capacity. Number 4 is knowledge adaptation and contextualization. Here I talk about all three: capacity, network, and content together. So a lot of times in the bigger projects where there are, or also in smaller one, when you have multiple sites, when you have multiple things being done in the same way, in the same project, or maybe even within different projects, you have this trust connection between the projects. You have different community of practices maybe, or maybe you have different learning sessions, because this project especially had learning sessions. It could be different forms of learning sessions as well. So when you have these various types of cross-connecting platform, you learn to resituate the knowledge in a different context. That builds, that helps you understand your content better, that helps to develop your capacity, and that brings you together with newer people, newer network, newer stakeholders. The fifth is knowledge dissemination. And this one is more about using your network to disseminate your content. And here with this project, especially what they did was they were very consistent throughout the project to disseminate their information. First, preliminary findings, just talking about what they want to do, what they have done until now. So they were very continuous about what sharing their information throughout. And they did it through mass media, through interpersonal skills, because when you have your whole university, but not everyone is involved. There is one or two people involved, but then you bring back to your organization and then you share what you did there. So those kind of things where you bring the knowledge outside the boundary of the project. So those kind of things can also be visible within these living labs. Number 6 and 7 also, they're about enabling activities. It's about a lot of times the solution could be there, but it is difficult to get it out because you do not understand the solution, you do not understand the problem in the same way. So it's about reaching the people where you have to get it done. So how can you have that done? You learn to do that. So you learn to use probably different things. And in this case was using plain language, having a separate training session so that people who are not in the same level of understanding will get that level of understanding, using neutral tone, being sensitive towards communication. So how the ways to promote openness and equalness within the group. So this was something that they learned to do during the project with trial and error, with mistakes, to engage better, to make combined decision making. And the final one is reflective learning pathway, where I talk about learning to learn. So at different levels, at individual levels, as a team or at a greater level, when you have different activities, you reflect on the assumptions that you have, or as a team, you reflect on the decisions that you made, and it leads to, it helps you, how to conduct yourself, or what worked and what did not in the second way. So that's this capacity to reflect, rectify, recommend in the next step is something that is also not a result of Living Lab. You don't really count it as a result, but it's something that is quite important within the project. It's something that everyone involved is learning, and it's an important outcome as well. So these are the 7 pathways that I kind of try to use the learning framework to develop, to kind of capture the impact of Living Labs, which are not just its results, but wider than its results, to see how are they more important, how can they benefit than any, like, for example, R&D research, for example. So these are the pathways, and now I will move into the last part of this long presentation on role of Living Labs in policy landscape. Because as I looked into the learning outcomes, I also saw how Living Labs made a network with other Living Labs to kind of influence policy in Netherlands. So that was something that was one of the outcomes that made a greater impact. That everyone can understand, because learning is something which not everyone prioritize as much as policy landscapes. I wanted to look into the policy influences of this kind of projects. But first, are e-living labs even capable of making any kind of policy changes or policy influences was the question. And then we can see more and more living labs being used in public policy and government sphere. And the reason behind it is living labs are suitable in many different ways to act as a policy tool. They produce actionable evidence, and that is something that evidence-based policymaking desires, and living labs can help in that part. They also act as boundary spanners where they can connect these different sectors together, which is also something that in some policymaking it's required or desired. And they also have this feedback loop and iterative way of working, which aligns with how policymaking is done. But based on this, I looked into the policy making part of living labs, but also it's important to understand policy making is not linear, and its policy development is very highly contingent. It's based on power, it's based on politics, it's based on many different ways, just than this beautiful way of coming together and co-creation, of course. So as a starting point, I took into the 6 stages of policy cycle from agenda making, policy design, implementation, monitoring and evaluation, and support. And why I did this was I wanted to break it down to see maybe living labs does not lead to a policy, but maybe living labs is more inclined to help in one of these steps within the policy cycle. If yes, then which step is it most useful to, where has it helped the most? So when I looked into it, I tried to first, before looking into the work of living labs and where they have the most influence on, I tried to look into how can they actually, theoretically, how can they actually, where can they make an impact and in what ways? So I think I'll just skip the details here. So I looked into all the different literatures where living labs were influencing policy in different ways. So we can see in the first pre-policy, in the third policy delivery, and in the last one post-policy, there most of the living labs are influencing in those parts. And those are the parts. Pre-policy is like agenda setting, researching beforehand. And policy delivery is there is a policy and you implement it by co-creating with different stakeholders. And in the post-policy, it's more about policy learning, policy integration. So that's also where living labs can influence. But in policy design, they're not really working much because it's more this contingent, this part where there is a formal decision-making required. And somehow in evaluation also, they're not very active because probably evaluation doesn't take place as much, maybe. So we can see this was an interesting phenomenon that we can notice, but also it makes sense based on the nature of living labs and based on the nature of these steps within the policy making. This should be here. Yeah, these are like the slides that were in wrong place. So I looked into 4 cases of Netherlands, including the previous work of Klimap, and I added few more living labs to have like a bigger pictures. And I only selected the living labs which are big and are working in the regional scales. And as you can see in Netherlands, there are a lot of living labs working in land and water management alone, because Netherlands is known to work for its land and water management work. There's a lot of delta works, there's a lot of coastal protection work, and now with the droughts, it is the focus on land and water is quite high. So I looked into this 4 different projects which are active in different parts, and I tried to see, what kind of, the selection was based on, because I already knew this project and I knew that they had some kind of influences. So I wanted to look what influences they made and how they made and where are they positioned. So they also follow the same pattern as the literature review showed. Most of them are in pre-policy, post-policy, and some in policy delivery. So the first 2, which is working with water and climate adaptation, the red and orange, they were more in the exploratory nature. They were only doing the field experiments, but not really putting any pilots into real scale solutions. So they were not really active in the policy delivery part. But the other two, which is Skaudiveland Living Lab, it is named after an island where it's active, and another is self-sustaining river systems. These two were actually, they were implementing the experiments that they had in real life. So they were really, they were able to scale up their experiments. So that's why we could also see them making the, working within the policy delivery part. So they were working into, they were implementing the solutions. Okay, so it's here. Okay, so now the last slide, because I think I've spoken for way too long. This one is, I wanted to look into, okay, why exactly did these projects made, what the kind of impact that they made. And I wanted to look into, probably this is not a general understanding, but probably it is understanding for these cases, but it would be a starting point to understand what exactly was going right with this project that they were able to make this kind of impacts that they made. I did not focus on what impacts, but I can tell you later if you're interested. So I looked into them and I saw that within the design of these living labs, they had strong engagement of different stakeholders, that high commitment, they had the ownership, because a lot of times the people who were involved were really involved, like the citizens were really involved and the government was really involved. So a lot of times I see that when there are academics carrying the project, it's a little difficult to get it to a position where you want to. But if there is, in this policymaking aspect especially, if there are government people and if there are local people carrying the project, then it makes a bigger impact because it is their location, their project, it relates to them better. Another one was structured learning, how they had a dedicated section for learning, dedicated way of including learning within the project. And third is they aligned their problem with social needs and policy needs. So that made their, in the hierarchy, that made their project become more visible for in the higher level of government, which were not directly involved within the project, because it seemed, the issue seemed more aligned socially and policy-wise. Within the context, they had like, because it was the context of Netherlands, they had a supportive environment internally as well as externally, what policies were going around at the national level, what policies were going around within the regional level. So those were the things that also went right for them. And the last one is producing high quality evidence. Is they produced high quality evidence, but they also published it, or they also made it in a, they also put their evidences in a place where it was visible for the right people. So for example, there are these newsletters which are kind of, consulted by politicians, consulted by policymakers. And so they were able to publish their result in those platforms so that it was closer to the people who will use the information. So, and that was very helpful for them to get in hand in those kind of platforms as well. So this is a little in-depth of all the work that I have presented here has been in these places. So if you want to go in very detailed, then they are there. Yes, thank you very much for listening to my super long chat.
Thanks, Astha. I think it wasn't long.
It wasn't?
No.
I felt like I talked for like a whole day.
But it's really great to see some scholarship around this being presented so clearly. And I think that's something that's been of interest to us, is how do we learn about living labs? What's effective? You know, you mentioned the epistemology behind living labs as well, and also, you know, how do we understand what is impactful, what sort of impacts are possible, So it's great to see that framed. I'm sure there's lots of questions and points for discussion. And just for everybody online, feel free to post your questions in the chat as well, so that we don't miss anything. But maybe we might just start in the room. Has anybody got any questions for Astha or reflections or comments? Maybe I'm going to pick on you, Diego, to start the conversation going. Oh, sorry.
No,
Harris? Diego, you've been working, your projects are in the field, sort of by definition. Do you see some of the work that you've been done reflected in Astha's framework here?
Yeah. Thanks very much, Astha. That was great. I guess there were a couple of thoughts as you were presenting. So absolutely, I think particularly the sort of framework for at a high level understanding the structure, and there are sort of key takeaways for me about how you structure learning and so on. But there were a couple of questions. One was about the end game of a living lab. And in some way, I'm to infer from the presentation that it's policy change. And therefore, I guess how you then, it's ultimately a particular type of living lab. I mean, I think there are other living labs that may have other end games, right? More around community or whatever the case may be. It so happens the ones we've been working on, I think, do have that. Also, it's policy change is the key objective, and therefore one key question is like it's about audience and who you are in some way trying to convince, or who you're trying to, it's typically government, and therefore I guess how you structure in how are you structuring conversation with government and existing policy, I guess more specifically as a particular end game? There's I guess, a question around how because there was the slide that you showed with the pre-policy, policy, and the number of papers.
Yeah.
And as a proxy for I guess the intelligence that's been developed around those particular areas of policy.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose on the one hand, I would say, and I wonder if you've done this, really, for example, interviewed government, the policy makers, and said, okay, well, what has worked and what hasn't worked? Often there is from my perspective, there's a huge disconnect from the living labs that are started in universities and academics, and the world of policy.
Yeah.
And there's an ill or not a great understanding of how, from an academic perspective, how you get to a policy change, and vice versa, from a policy change or policy perspective, maybe not a great value or understanding of how evidence or academic scholarship can inform policy change.
Yeah.
So for me, that is a key question, and it's amusing, I suppose, in a way. I mean, for me, the Netherlands is in some way, it's a very useful location to start in, because I think it's a very sophisticated policy landscape already, and there's probably already a kind of understanding of living labs and what they provide and so on and so forth. But like, for example, the context that we work in Indonesia, Southeast Asia, Fiji, there is not at all.
No.
And there's very little understanding, very little support.
Yeah.
And so it's in a location of under-resourced governments, innovation is very hard because it takes you away from business as usual.
Yeah.
So if you want to innovate, you have to have a kind of environment that's supportive, with a view that then that will lead to some policy change and some intelligence that will support policy change. So I guess that's the question for me, is then how do you, from this, take it more explicitly to understanding how you get from one to the other? If you're in the Netherlands, maybe, and I haven't worked in the Netherlands, but from, you know, the people that I know are working in this space, Rob Robin and others, there's quite a sophisticated understanding already, but how you might then adopt some of those into other locations where it's really base and it's not that way at all, how you start from a living lab to an end game of policy change.
No, but that's a really interesting question. It is, the context matters a lot. Not all first of all, you're right, like not all living labs would have policy change as their end game, policy influence as the end game. I happen to realize that, oh, these Dutch living labs are actually working towards the policy change. That's something that I turned myself into later in my project, because I thought that was like something I did not expect living labs, a small project, to make such policy influence that they did. And I was interested, surprised, and positively to see the impact that they could have. And even in Netherlands, these living labs that I'm talking about, which made any influence, it's not big influence, it's small operational changes that they could make.
Right.
These are also much bigger living labs, which are working at a regional level, which have, when they say, okay, this is our result, they can say about, oh, it's not about this municipality or it's not about this small area, but they're talking about the regional level. So they can have more, you know, when there is evidence, you can't bring evidence from one location to other location and just replicate it as well. So you need to have evidence that is more reflective of the area that they're talking about. And when there is a regional evidence from a regional area, then it's more easier for the regional government to take that as evidence and use that to tweak the, you know, the existing policies. So even in Netherlands, even where there is this idea of polder system where you don't get to, I realize you know it. So there is this idea of working together. There is idea of coming to consensus. There is this idea since long before living labs, long before, you know, there is this culture. And even there, it's not easy when the living labs are at smaller scale. But there are living labs which are, the living labs I'm aware of are only in Europe, unfortunately. So there are living labs at national level as well. For example, in Andorra, it's a very small country, and there they have national level living labs where the involved public bodies are from the national government as well. So probably if it depends on who do you have in your living labs team. If you only have someone from municipality, then probably you can't reach as far. But if you have someone from a bit higher up in the hierarchy, then maybe that can make a little bit of in a higher impact, not guaranteed impact, but higher impact, because then you know you reached someone. Maybe they want to take it still. That is very, you can't say, you know, it's like, that's why I started with policy making is like a non-linear and very contingent process. It's about politics. It's about, I mean, we know that politicians don't really take evidence, the real ground fact, and their truth is really different a lot of times. And we see that more and more in our life. Like we can see that, right? Like everywhere, like
sometimes politicians are looking for the evidence to support their perspective.
Exactly, and they make evidence. They do all sorts of things. So we know that it's like, it's not given. It is something that I have to work towards. And it's like, when we talk about countries like Indonesia, or I am originally from Nepal, and I know how government work in, you know, Asian context. So it doesn't, I think living labs will work in democracy, first of all. Maybe it's a bold statement to say.
Right, one more question in the room, and then we've got a question on the chat.
Thanks. So apologies for being late. I got stuck in the car park, but I was listening, and as I was walking over, I'm really interested in the learning pathways framework that you've developed. I've been slowly in the process of looking at the impact pathways in our children living lab program. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on the empirical data and analysis that underpin that, the conceptualization of learning pathways, and how did you develop those, that typology, I guess?
So did you see the learning framework?
Yes.
Yeah, so I had 3 sections in the learning framework. One is about type, one is about the process, and the other one is about the levels. And while making pathways, the idea behind pathway is you need to have a systematized way of looking into the activities. So what I did was I focused on the type, and I grouped it into content. Those are 3: the substantive content, capacity, and network. And I looked into one which has content and network, one that has network and capacity, and one that has all 3. So through the 3 subsets, I made 1, 2, 3, and 3 common, and 1 where all 3 are common. So that's where the 7 pathways came from. And I looked into within each of them different levels and different types of learning. So that was the initial, the 7 lines that I came up with. And within those, I first listed out all the activities that's occurring in the living labs, and I grouped them into. It's very elaboratively explained in the paper with all the, the idea behind how I generated this. And then I framed them into the activities. I looked into which activities will fall into which category. And then I went further with the pathway, and the name came at the end. So the first, it was the process, and the name at the end.
And just a quick follow-up, did you talk to people involved in the project?
Yeah.
Or it was mainly, and you were also observing, I think.
I involved them to collect all the information, and I involved them to check with them if I am understanding because a lot of times you get lost in communication. So that's where I focused on. But the pathway itself, I did not take their help to do the pathway, because I also realized that a lot of times it's when there are people involved in the project, when you involve them in doing this scientific analysis, it gets a bit stained because they want it to go in a certain direction. And so I thought it's better not to. Yeah. So there are, yeah.
Cool. Shaman, you've posted a similar question, I think, regarding that point on the learning framework, but I think that diving a bit deeper on how stakeholders were involved in co-creating and refining the framework. Did you want to speak to that question? I can see you up on the screen there, but maybe you want to respond. Hi, Shaman.
Hi.
Hi.
Oh, yeah, it's kind of similar questions Paris raised, and the designing and validating a process of the component of this learning framework. That was my question, particularly because I'm doing similar type of works in my PhD.
Yeah.
So I'm more focused or interested about the process you have followed to develop the learning framework. Yeah.
Developing the learning framework was a completely theoretical process.
Theoretical. Okay.
Yeah. So developing the framework was about understanding the living labs itself, understanding its characteristics, understanding, what are the applicable, not necessarily occurring in practice, but all the list of learning theories that can potentially occur within the living labs setting. So that was the starting point of looking into this learning theories that occur in the living lab. And to develop from theories to framework, the step that I took was to begin with these questions. Okay, what is being learned? So, okay, there are learning theories, but what is being learned? And who is learning? There were more questions, but later it was easier for the framework, as I worked on, to stick to these 3 main questions. And within these questions, I tried to answer these questions for each learning theory. There were actually over 40 learning theories that I collected, which is in the paper, and it was narrowed down to the final seven big theme of theories. And within this, each learning theory, I looked into these questions and answered, like, okay, for each one, because if we look into social learning, for example, we do not really get you don't get much in the content part, for example, because it's more about the relational. So in one, you can get more of the network. In one, we can get all. So I had also this list in like a big table form, like for each learning theory, what is present for, and then that led to the framework, because after analyzing the each theory. So that this is a very theoretical process. That's why I tried to use the theoretical framework in the case study to see, okay, how can we apply it in practice? So then only the application part is empirical, but the theory, the framework is theoretical.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. And while we're online, Darren, I can see you've got three questions all wrapped up into one. Did you want to speak to those?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, thanks so much, Astha, for your great presentation. Just wanted to have a quick discussion with you about capability building with the Net Zero Precincts Living Lab that Sam Ryan and I have led over the last couple of years. There were various cycles of engagement that we went through to bring our participants up to speed, to onboard them, to mentor them, to introduce them to interdisciplinary methods and living lab ways of work. And so the first part of my question relates to your insights around capability building. And then the follow-up, if there's time, is around monitoring and evaluation specifically. I really liked your learning framework, and we've done a lot of work and are really interested in how you measure transformative outcomes in living lab settings. So if there's time, it'd be good to hear your thoughts on that as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Capacity building, I only look into capacity building as like one little aspect within the bigger picture, but I know there are these living labs which primarily focus on capacity building alone as well. So how I look into capacity building within living labs through these pathways is just the one that I explained before, through being able to use tools or being able to learn how to engage and being able to learn, because this spoke true to the empirical study that I worked with. But then there are also, I'm sure, many other different ways. So what I do not do in this project that I've realized now in my study is I do not look into how can we design better. I'm more at the analysis level, what did they do and what did they get out of it? So it's more like not giving a recommendation on how can you make it better, or being more comprehensive about, a list of things that you can improve, but more looking and understanding and analyzing what went within this project and what went right, what went wrong. So it's more in that level. So I wouldn't be able to exactly say, the beautiful points on how you can add in that sector. But now talking about monitoring and evaluation, I did one work where I tried to combine this learning theory with theory of change and try to apply it on evaluation of living lab. And there I used learning framework just to have this logical, in the theory of change, what we do is we have this, the logical link of, the assumptions and the reasonings. And there I used these elements from learning to reason. So that's something that I have done, which is, which I worked in this European network of living labs, where Sam was also there a few weeks ago. So there I worked on that, but it's also really on the beginning stage. I do want to develop it further, and it's something that I'm also looking forward to see how can I use it into the monitoring and evaluation, because I think there is some potential there. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Astha.
Thank you so much, Devin.
Fantastic. Time zone is 2:58
in the night.
So
yes,
really well done. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. It's important to lay out these questions.
Yeah,
it's interesting to look at the experience based on perspectives from Holland, from the Netherlands, in comparison to some of the work that we're doing.
Yeah,
as Dave was mentioning, in Indonesia, Southeast Asia, and India, where there's a lot of aspect of the work that you've covered going on, but not necessarily framed
Exactly.
in terms of a living lab per se. And in fact, in our own experience in India, framing it as a living lab didn't really work. So great. And also I just to mention that MAID has been generous to provide a small research cluster grant for us to investigate how we might take on these sorts of questions, whether there's a case for us to build some more infrastructure around the scholarship that you've been presenting today. So if anyone online wants to stay in touch with that, feel free to send me an email and we'll loop you in. But on behalf of us here at MAIDA and MSDI, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for hosting me.
Pleasure.
Yeah, it was lovely. Thank you.